On this episode of China Unscripted, are Chinese military-aged men flooding the U.S. southern border? Why China might take over Korea? And what was a sketchy Chinese biolab doing with Ebola in California? Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Jung.
And I'm Matt Ganesha.
And joining us once again is Joshua Philipp. He's the host of the show Crossroads at the Epoch Times, and he's just come out with a new documentary called Weapons of Mass Migration. Josh, welcome back to the show. It's been a hot minute.
Yeah, been a while. Great to be back.
Yeah. I hear you just got back from Rome. I have a question. How often do you think about Rome?
I literally think about Rome multiple times a day.
Amen.
Is this about to become
when I saw the article on that, I was like, oh, it's not just me.
I think that's why it kind of went viral, because like every guy was like, yeah, of course. And every woman was like,
wait, Chris, how often do you think of Rome?
Multiple times a day.
Matt?
Okay, here we are.
Probably half of multiple times a day.
I'm not surprised that Chris thinks about Rome multiple times a day, but I would be surprised if you thought about it that much.
Yeah, I mostly actually think about Venice.
The 1400s, the height of Venice.
Or Venice in California.
Well, both, actually.
Okay.
Venice Beach. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. I found out an interesting fact that, in the book of Revelation where it talks about the number of the beast being 666, apparently that's like a little code for Nero.
Is
Nero?
Yeah, because in the original Aramaic version it was 616, and in the later version 666, because it's kind of like code for like going through the what do you call it, their alphabet to like say like the title of Nero. Who interesting.
It makes sense. I mean, given he carried out most of the persecutions early on,
And not just that, but when he died, there was this cult that kind of emerged that said he had actually just retreated to like Asia Minor to recuperate from his illnesses, from his wounds, kind of like Arthurian in a way, and that he would return and save Rome. And this belief even continued centuries later, to the point that when the Western Christian Roman Empire was beginning to collapse, people were still saying Nero would come back and kick out all the Christians and restore the proper worship to the Roman gods.
Interesting. We're going to have that final battle of King Arthur returning and Nero returning. Huh?
Which one will win?
I'm speechless, frankly.
Yes. So I think about Rome a lot. But besides your fantastic trip to Rome, you also went down to Panama. I hear they have great canals.
Amazing canals. The best canals. Yeah.
So you mentioned something. You did a documentary about that, about the way migrants are getting into the U.S. And you mentioned something in the documentary called Global Compact on Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. Now, what is that? What is that?
So the Global Compact on migration is the agreement that is running most of the border crisis that we're just not being told about. And so the investigation I was doing down there was focused mostly on finding out what the heck is going on. And that was one of the big revelations I came to. This isn't some random, just happened kind of thing. It's that our own government signed an agreement with the United Nations to make this happen. And so, when I went down to Panama, I gained access to the 4 main migrant camps at the southern border on the Darién Gap. I got access to all 4 of them. And you find that the United Nations just has a massive presence. Like, they have tents there. There's different NGOs there. What happens is people come in, they get off their boats. They have these Indian canoes they use. They're called piraguas. They unload them. They get in line at the big United Nations tent, and they register with the United Nations. And then the whole process is they just bus them country to country Once they reach the United States, they're then arrested by Border Patrol, which is why if you see a lot of the mainstream media, they say that, hey, arrests are up. What happens is this: they arrest them, they take them to what are called processing facilities. This is between Customs Border Protection and Department of Homeland Security. They process them, they get them registered on the amnesty program, they load them on buses, and then they drop them off on the streets of the US. And they give them a free airplane ticket anywhere they want to go. Like, that's what's actually happening. And it's happening because of the Global Compact for Migration.
So
Mhm.
what does it say? Like, why is that causing this?
Well, it's set up. It's set up the process to facilitate what they call, safe and orderly migration, basically, and so it created the infrastructure for it. If you go back to like 2016, the original agreement they had on it was a precursor. It was based on a New York program with the United Nations before it was an official compact. And under that program, basically, the United Nations Human Rights Commission, Commission on Refugees, they came out and they were talking about it because they're one of the main organizations pushing for it. And the narrative they had was that there were tens of millions of people in the world, mostly in third world countries, who they deemed were either refugees or migrants, because they were latching on the whole idea of global warming, right? To frame these people as climate change migrants. And so they wanted to create a program to facilitate the movement of these individuals, mostly into Western Europe and the United States. And the system they had, again, the precursor was a New York agreement, which eventually evolved into the Global Compact on Migration. And what it does is it sets up funding, it sets up United Nations operations, and they do their work mainly through NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And they run these operations, tents, checkpoints, buses, and so on, to facilitate the movement of people, country by country, either into Western Europe, Canada, or the United States, for the most part.
So the argument is that this is happening, so the UN is here to make it a safe and orderly process.
That's what they claim. That's what they
Mhm.
claim. But if you go into the actual website of the Global Compact, they talk about global equity, and it ties into the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And so it's basically part of this whole global governance system and agenda they're trying to push, which is where you get different interests and different reasonings, country by country, organization by organization, and even like individual by individual.
I have a logistical question about this travel that these migrants are going through. So you were in Panama, and there's this infamous part called the Darién Gap that you mentioned, right? So like what we're told is that this is like really grueling, that people have to walk like a week on foot to get through the Darién Gap because there's no transportation through that. Is that still the case if the UN is coming in and like facilitating this?
Yeah. So one of the camps I went to was it was an Embera Indian village, and so you have these native Central American camps, basically, right? One of the camps I was at had been converted into one of the processing camps. So the United Nations had a huge presence at this Embera Indian village, and when the migrants or illegal immigrants were coming out of the Darién Gap, that was the first place they were going to, and they were getting registered with the United Nations. There was a big, UN tent and a big line of people, basically. But I went around and I talked to people coming out of the Darién Gap, and I was like, "Well, what is it like? What did you experience?" Every single person I talked to, individual by individual, said they would never do it again. I was told they said there were dead bodies all over the place. Almost every person I talked to had been robbed because there's cartels and gangs that go in there and they rob and they rape and they kill. I talked to a woman. She said that she was with her husband. She had a child. I believe it was the one, yeah. She was walking. They were walking through the gap. They encountered a gang. And these individuals, they were raping a woman. Her husband tried stopping the rape, and these individuals stoned her husband to death in front of her, just emphasizing what these people are dealing with. And I mean, so every person I talked to, they said they would never do it again. They said it was absolutely horrific. It was really difficult. It's extremely dangerous, not even because of the gangs, but just because of, like, you have sheer cliffs, especially when it's the rainy season. You have monsoons coming in, people drown, they slip off cliffs. There are narrow walkways that are just muddy. I mean, the place, let's put it this way. That's the only part of the Pan American Highway that does not connect. Right, the Pan American Highway goes all the way from northern Alaska all the way down to the southern tip of South America. The only place it doesn't connect is the Darién Gap. They could bridge it everywhere else, even in Alaska. This is, the Army Corps of Engineers, which built the Panama Canal. And I mean, that's like a wonder of just engineering. I mean, the thing is not even like computer run. It's like, it pulls water from nearby lakes, it drains, it's incredible. They could build that, but they couldn't build a bridge through the Darién Gap, just emphasizing how crazy that area is. And so, what you hear about the Darién Gap is absolutely true. It's extremely, extremely dangerous, and the gangs just make it worse.
Well, and so that seems like that kind of is to the UN's point about how they do need to have a presence to provide medical treatment, to provide care, because there are these horrible things these people are encountering.
Well, I mean, and there's two arguments for that, right? One argument is, well, they have the Red Cross, they have Doctors Without Borders. It's some of the camps I went to, they had a presence. I talked to a lot of the migrants coming through. I show what they have to say, and some of them are like, yeah, we go there, they do treat us, but a lot of them say they don't really get what they think they need, frankly. I had one individual, for example, he had a terrible just skin infection, and he wasn't able to get treatment because they said that he had to get new clothes because they wouldn't treat him otherwise, basically, but he couldn't get new clothes, and so he was kind of stuck. The other argument, though, is, you could argue that they're helping facilitate and they're making it safer. But the other side of it is that their very presence and them doing this is what is causing people to go by the millions and try to, come to the U.S. That this wasn't really happening, at least nowhere near this scale, until they started up this whole process facilitating it.
When did this compact begin?
Sorry, 2015, 2016. It was right before Trump came into office.
I think it's pretty interesting because it reminds me of an article I was just reading about a lot of cities in the U.S. dealing with nonprofits that have come to help with a certain situation, right? Like homelessness or affordable housing, crime intervention, but then essentially they become like the city governments will pay them to do this, but then the nonprofits essentially become incentivized to not stop the problem because
we covered that on American Uncovered.
Yeah, like the idea is that they become like it becomes a kind of this like industrial complex, right? Like the southern border industrial complex where the HHS or Homeland Security pays all these nonprofits to house migrants or do these things because the government can't handle it themselves. So yeah, I wonder about that's what you're talking about. Like the UN comes in and now sets up an infrastructure with all these NGOs, and now there's a industry around migrants crossing like extremely dangerous areas to try to get to the US.
Yeah, and it's even more than that too, because I mean, it's not only that, but part of the process is they pay, built into the migrant trail are areas where you have to go through human traffickers. So, for example, Nicaragua is not part of the global compact for migration. And so when people, they go through Panama, they go through Costa Rica, they hit Nicaragua, you have to use human traffickers once you reach Nicaragua. And so they're built into the system. The same thing when you reach the northern part of Mexico and you're about to cross into the United States, you have to go through the cartels. And the cartels, they're making $5,000, $7,000 per person, or they kill you. And that's built into the process they've established.
Because those are the realities of what they have to work around to accomplish this migration.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and that raises the question too, because, I talked to the head of Senafront, the former head of Senafront in Panama, and Senafront is like their border patrol / their military. They technically don't have a military. They're kind of like Costa Rica. Senafront is basically a military. They wear army fatigues, they carry military weapons, but they don't call themselves a military. But they do the security. They're they're integrated into the migrant camps because they're kind of the security for it, right? And so, for example, if they get news that gang members are raping and killing and stuff like that, they'll go into the Darién Gap and try to stop it. Sometimes they'll end up killing the gang members. But they also deal with the United Nations and the NGOs, like suing them all the time. If they inhibit movement of people, they get sued. And it's not just in Panama; it's all across Latin America. Even in Mexico, for example, I talked to one journalist, an Oscar Rodriguez. He's a Mexican journalist who I was with in the documentary, and he said that he was embedded with some of the different migrant caravans. He said that there were Venezuelan cartel members, Tren de Aragua, integrated into these groups, and they actually started rioting. They were threatening to kill Mexican authorities, and when the Mexican authorities tried stopping them because there were violent gang members, telling them they're going to start cutting throats and stuff like that, they had to let them go because the United Nations intervened and forced them to allow them to go. And, so the problem I ran into in Panama was the government there and Senafront, they were saying that the NGOs are even at a point now where they're undermining national sovereignty, that the countries don't feel they can even enforce their normal laws, or they face like international lawsuits and so on.
Wow, that's amazing how this sort of global international thing can just end up having such a profound influence on the running of just your own nation.
Well, I mean, especially if you're a small nation like Panama,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and that goes into something else too, which is, in America, we don't see the United Nations as having that much influence. Like, if they talk about Interpol or whatever else, we don't feel they have any jurisdiction over us. Like the way Americans view the United Nations is it's more like a diplomatic thing. For the most part, that's how we see it, right? But if you go into Latin America, even if you go into Europe, the United Nations is actually really powerful. They have a lot of influence. Like they're more powerful than the local governments in a lot of ways. And so when you go into these countries, it's not like here. It's like the United Nations is running operations, and they're like a more powerful government than the country they're in.
Which is what many commentators in the United States are afraid of, that it then becomes, it doesn't matter what the people of a nation, their elected officials, whatever policies they want to enact, it's being controlled by this outside world government, I guess, that they don't have control or say in.
Yeah, and that's where it gets real concerning, because one of the things I dig into in the documentary is I want to find out why the heck they're doing this, because in America we're not really being, like, not only are we not being told why they're doing it, we're not even being told that there was an agreement that facilitates it. This isn't part of our discussion, and I think because of that we're having a false debate in this country. People are debating over whether it's racist to, not like the migrants. And that's pretty much where like the normal right-left debate is. We're not debating over whether we should be part of this international agreement to facilitate the whole thing, using our tax dollars. And keep in mind, U.S. tax dollars are used for this. There's even a UN agreement. It's called the Grand Bargain Pact. And they have a program called cash-based intervention, where American tax dollars are being handed out to people illegally immigrating here in the form of cash in envelopes, or like prepaid debit cards, like EBT cards, basically, like welfare cards, basically. And that's our tax dollars doing that.
Well, that's fantastic. We put that money into their pockets. They come to the United States and they pump that back into the economy.
There you go. Modern economics, Chris.
I thought that it was only in New York City that they were getting the debit cards. didn't know.
So there's different programs. New York City's doing it on a city level. Chicago's doing stuff similar. But there's also, that's in the U.S., but in Latin America, they have programs run through the United Nations that do the same thing. And because, again, the purpose is to facilitate it into the U.S. or into Canada, that's our tax dollars doing that as well.
Well, so then I guess this brings into ultimately where we're going with this on China Unscripted is, did you see many Chinese migrants involved in this? How is China tying into this?
I did. Let me tell you a bit of that. So first off, one of the guys I worked with, again, Oscar Rodriguez, is a Mexican journalist. He actually had a video that he provided to us. We included in the documentary, which actually is a commercial aimed at Chinese people to illegally enter the United States. And it's a commercial run by a South American cartel. Like, it's crazy. The commercial plays out and it has Chinese sounding music, like just super stereotypical Chinese music. And it's Chinese people, like families, and they're riding on horses and they're riding in boats and they're walking and everybody's smiling. And they have these cartel gunmen with them. It's bizarre. It's totally bizarre. It's a commercial advertising human trafficking for Chinese is part of this being run by one of the cartels. And what I was told, I don't go too deep into it in the documentary, but actually it's a route that goes from a part of the Middle East into either directly into Colombia, then up through the Darién Gap, or into some other countries. Because if you pay more money, you can bypass the Darién Gap, right? But it's just that the smuggling routes are controlled by human trafficking organizations. So if you want to take the fancy route, you got to pay more money. But what happened was this. So when I was in Panama, there was an incident where one of the main camps where Chinese people come in at, there had been a boat that capsized with a bunch of Afghanis on board. And because the boat had capsized, they had briefly shut down that port. And so the main wave of Chinese migrants were not there when I was there. But regardless of that, I still encountered quite a few of them. So in Panama itself, I interviewed several of them. And then also later on, I went to the U.S.-Mexico border and gained access because I was with one of the Border Patrol Union guys who got me access to some parts you normally can't get access to. And when I was at the U.S.-Mexico border, there were tons of Chinese. Maybe 1 out of every 4 or 1 out of every 5 people we saw was Chinese, and they were just group after group. The individuals I talked to, though, because I know some people are like, "Oh, is the CCP running this?" Every person I talked to who was Chinese was really anti-CCP. One individual I talked to was a house Christian. And they were saying that basically, they weren't able to practice their faith in China. They were saying that in the Christian churches in China, you have to sing Communist Party hymns. I mean, I know you guys talk about this stuff too.
It's good to bring up here, though.
Yeah, I talked to another individual who was actually worked in finance in China. I met this guy at one of the migrant camps right at the mouth of the Darién Gap. And so this guy went through the Darién Gap despite having a lot of money for some reason. This individual said that basically the Chinese economy was collapsing. He said the CCP was becoming out of its mind. And he was saying that everyone's trying to get out. Other people I talked to another guy, he said that his daughter was being abused in the school system in China. He was talking about how just crazy authoritarian it is. Every person I talked to was fleeing China, not because they were pro-CCP or whatever, because they were legitimately fleeing China. I didn't talk to a single person who was pro-CCP.
Well, that is interesting because a lot of the, online commentators are like, these are Chinese Fifth Army infiltration, some horrible. It's a plot by China to undermine the U.S.
I think there was a lot of talk about how they are all young men of military age.
Chinese men are crossing the border.
Yeah.
So I actually, if you watch my documentary, I'm actually kind of sympathetic to the migrants. I don't criticize them. My whole thing is I think we should be talking about what's actually running the whole thing, and I think we should be talking more about that. You know what I mean? But on the individual level, like, it wasn't just young men or military age men, which I know a lot of people, like you were saying, a lot of the online commentators say that. You had there were a lot of kids, there were a lot of women still. It is, I think the majority technically are men, but I saw a good mix of people. You know what I mean? One of the Chinese individuals I ran across was when I was in San Ysidro. It was a really sad story. It was this young Chinese girl, and she was walking with a Chinese guy who I thought they were related at first. It turns out that she was just trying to find somebody to be safe with. We were driving to the big opening in the wall because people were just streaming across, and she waves us down, panicking. We stop. She had a big wooden cross. I didn't ask her about her religion, but I assume she was Christian. And then she just breaks down crying in front of us. I mean, the girl must have been like late teens, early 20s. It's hard to tell sometimes with Chinese. They look younger than they are. But she was breaking down crying. She said that she didn't want to come. She said her mom made her. She was begging us for help. I admittedly, I gave her some water and some food. I told her that I couldn't give her a ride because, I could be charged with a crime if I do that. But, she's coming across, she didn't have any supplies, and she's in like an arid area. I didn't want her dying. You know what I mean? So I gave her some water and some food. And then she just burst into tears and she started bowing and stuff. I mean, I can appreciate, the humanity in it. Every person I talked to had a really sad story, to be honest. The people from Latin America, I talked to a lot of people from Ecuador, and they were saying that there's just gangs just killing people. Like they said, they can't live. They can't live because these gangs, they extort people, they kill people. It's impossible to live because the gangs are so powerful. Same thing with Venezuela, with the socialist policies they have there. I mean, the problem is, though, is as a country, can we bring in like all of Ecuador? can we bring in like all of China? It's not an easy issue, right?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that should be where the energies and efforts of the UN are directed at doing something about the cartels, rather than potentially creating a system that empowers the cartels.
And that was actually a conversation I had with quite a few people. When I talked to the former head of Centerfront, that's one of the things he was saying. When I talked to this guy, Oscar Ramirez, this Mexican journalist, that's what he was saying. People were saying that actually the UN is making it worse because they're actually preventing policing against a lot of the gangs. They're preventing police from arresting cartel members when they're embedded with the migrants. They're going after Centerfront when Centerfront sends troops into the mountains and kills, cartel members who are raping and killing and robbing people. I mean, one of the real terrible parts in the video that I have was provided to me by Oscar Ramirez because he's walked through the Gap several times. He said that they were at the mouth. They were down the hill in the Darién Gap, one of the many mountains, right? And group after group of people coming through. He was with Centerfront, so he had like an armed guard with him, right? He was with Centerfront, and group after group is coming to them, and every woman was saying that they had just been raped. Every one of them, like group after group after group. They were saying that there's people out there, they're robbing us and they're raping us. And, one of the clips we had was this young girl. I mean, she was a kid, like maybe like early teens. And she was traumatized. She couldn't talk, right? And her family was like, she's traumatized. She can't talk to you. And so actually Centerfront went into the jungle to go find it. When they went there, they found one of these cartel members in the process of raping a girl. There were two guys, two or three, I can't remember now. As soon as they saw Centerfront, they had guns. They opened fire on Centerfront. They started shooting at them, and they got in a full-blown shootout with these cartel, right? Centerfront and the cartel. They ended up killing one of them and then injuring the other and then arresting him. And in the shootout, the woman who was being raped, she got hit by a bullet. They had to life flight her out of there. I mean, stuff like this. You know what I mean? But that's the issue. Is this whole movement? It's creating this problem because they're not dealing. Why is the United Nations not supporting anti-crime initiatives in Ecuador, for example? Why are they criticizing? El Salvador for going after MS-13? Instead, they're criticizing El Salvador for doing it. Really, why not solve the problem rather than subsidize the problem, rather than facilitate the problem? Why build an infrastructure on top of a problem rather than fix it? And so they're not going after the causes of anything. If anything, they're probably making it a lot worse because they're pouring money, like billions of dollars, into the pockets of human traffickers by facilitating this process. And the other side, too, is when you have people who become aggrieved with problems in their country and you just create an opening for all of them to leave, what happens? Well, they don't fix the problem. The problem never gets fixed because the people who have issues with it don't stay to fix it. And it's creating a system where it's institutionalizing the problems rather than fixing them. And the people I were talking to, that was one of the big concerns that they actually had with all this.
I'm just going to take a shot in the dark with this and see if you have any thoughts on it. But I know the CCP has a lot of high-level control over the UN. Do you think, like, what is their take on mass migration? Because I know the CCP doesn't want people leaving China.
I heard a lot of things. There's a few different sides to it. So first of all, one of the reasons why the people go that far down on the migrant route, right? Because people ask, okay, like, why don't they just come directly to the United States, right? People are like, well, how do they get visas from China to leave, right? That's actually why they go so far south, is because they have to go to countries that don't require visas. So they'll go into Ecuador, they'll go into Colombia, for example. Then they'll move up, but that's why they go so far south, actually. That, and also just because it's like the cheaper route. The other side of it, though, there's two sides. Briefly, we mentioned the idea of like a fifth column and China using these people. They do that, but I'll talk about that in the main point you mentioned. But this is important to mention as well. The CCP has stuff set up in the United States to control people once they get here. And that's, of course, the United Front Work Department and the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office. The United Front is like the system of governance the CCP has built. The Overseas Chinese Affairs Office is how the CCP documents and registers and tracks all Chinese expats. They even include second and third generation Chinese in their system, which is why Chinatowns are such unique areas that the CCP tries to control them as if they're provinces of China. And so even if they come here, the cartels, or sorry, the snakeheads, the triads, the Chinese front organizations, they'll still try to control these people. They will absolutely try to control them, and they will absolutely try to keep them within their orbit and then use them without a doubt, because that's how the CCP operates. On the United Nations level, though, what you were asking about, they have different interests. So there's a couple different things. So as you know, the CCP has huge influence over the United Nations. I mentioned that there's a few different agendas at play. With the UN, they're talking about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They're talking about global equity, which is global governance. But for the CCP, they're actually talking about, they have an agenda called the multipolar world order, right? The multipolar world order led by a China model. Xi Jinping has publicly talked about this. Vladimir Putin in Russia has openly supported the idea of a multipolar world order led by a China model. Alexander Dugin, one of the main advisors to Vladimir Putin, I read his books to see for myself. What he talks about in his books is the creation of a fourth political system, which takes fascism and communism, merges them together into what they call national Bolshevism, and then use that to challenge what they call the liberal democratic world order, and to create, as he says, a multipolar world order. And so for the CCP, for Russia, for Iran, even for the World Economic Forum, they often talk about this. They want what's called a multipolar world order. And what that is this. The current world order, the US-led world order, what they call the Pax Americana, the peace under America. The idea that if a country violates human rights to a certain extent, America might sanction them. That there are certain values that are given, certain inherent human rights given to us by God. That whole idea of what America represents, that's called the Pax Americana. They refer to that as the unipolar world order, the US-led world order, right? One country world order under America. They want to create what they call the multipolar world order, whereby America has been diminished and other countries have what they call shared global governance. So, for example, Alexander Dugin, one of Putin's main advisors, talks about creating different regional powers within the multipolar world order. Vladimir Putin himself has backed the idea that Xi Jinping has of having this, but having the China model of governance being the system adopted across the board. And so for them, to create that, they have to diminish the unipolar world order. And that means tearing down the United States. And so they have to diminish the power of the US and its main supporters, which is Western Europe. And where are all the migrants going? They're going to the US and they're going to Western Europe. And then the other big thing of it, too, is that the CCP is trying to start up wars right now. Remember, Qin Canrong, one of Xi Jinping's main advisors, had advised Xi Jinping that if they want to start a war with the United States, they have to start 4 different wars. They wanted a war with a terrorist organization. I think we have that now. Look at the resurgence of global terrorism being run through the CCP's proxies, working with Iran, right, restarting the flames of global terror. They have the war with Russia. Qin Canrong actually wanted a conflict in Latin America with Brazil, but because Bolsonaro got into power, that derailed the whole thing. Lula de la Silva, right? That was their main guy. And Lula's back in office now, so they want to revive that. And what I was told by individuals off record, I can talk about it, I can't talk about it, who told me it when I was in Panama. They were saying that one of the big agendas with Venezuela, for example, is they want to invade Guyana. That they're increasing the rate of people getting into the systems of mass migration. And they're doing that, according to the individuals I talked to, because they're trying to destabilize Latin America and they're trying to keep America busy, right? They're forcing us to drain our budgets and deal with a crisis because they want to clear the way for them to invade Guyana. And then in Guyana, they just found one of the world's largest oil reserves, which the CCP has, from the get-go, moved into and already gained huge influence over. And so what's going to happen? Well, Lula's back in office in Brazil. Lula's probably going to back, of course, Venezuela as they do that, and you're going to have a regional war. And so that's the CCP's conflicts right there. This is part of the CCP's agenda as well. Not saying that they're the only driving force with it, but they're using it. They're absolutely using it.
Yeah, I remember we recently talked to Gilman Lailarli, who talked about this, that the CCP wants, or is at least very happy that there are these wars that are sort of draining U.S. resources and attention. I think even recently, I think it was Mike McCall who was in Taiwan. He was saying that part of the problem of U.S. being late with deliveries of weapons to Taiwan is because the military-industrial complex can't keep up because it's being drained so much.
Yeah, might I suggest the CCP get us involved in a naval war, so at least they could tie up our naval resources for Taiwan.
Thank you.
There aren't too many countries capable of a naval war. Is actually the issue.
That's true.
Yeah, unless, of course, the CCP tries to invade Korea.
Okay, that's where you're going. Well, before we get to that, I do want to have a question about this idea of this multipolar world order with the Chinese model, China model, or whatever. Is that not just a CCP-led world order? Is it actually multipolar?
It's not just CCP. Mm-hmm. The CCP would try to dominate it. I mean, because we know how the CCP is. The CCP is not into the idea of sharing power. But the way that there's different views of how it would look. If you go to the World Economic Forum and listen to some of their speeches on the multipolar world order, they have this glowing idea of global shared governance and an equitable world order, where they want to have, for example, governments, NGOs, banks, big corporations kind of having equal power. That it's not just elected government having governmental authority, but even big corporations, banks, and non-governmental organizations, with the United Nations kind of playing like the overarching role with it. If you go to the UN, they're talking about this as well. Just in terms of, they just believe this is where the world is heading, and for them that's great because they want to have more power, right? They want to have more authority. They want to have more of a say over local politics. That's what the UN does, right? And then when you get to the CCP, they're talking about a multipolar world order led by a China model because that's their agenda, and they want to have the world adopt the China model. But then if you go to Russia, they're talking about different regions. And so Alexander Dugin, for example, talks about regional powers, that they'll have like the Africa power, they'll have the Latin America power, they'll have the United States as just one of the many players on the table, that they want to have Russia control like what they call the Eurasian region, of course, not including China. And so, that's what they're talking about is regional blocks of power that have kind of the way of running this whole new order they talk about.
Yeah, sharing, power. It all sounds so good until you remember that, like, the vast majority of the world is led by authoritarian governments.
Yeah, that's the whole problem with the World Economic Forum. But I mean, like, I've heard the idea that you can sum up communism as just, you should feel bad, give me your stuff. And that's essentially what this is with the United States. Like the US, you should feel bad, diminish yourself, give up power, give us your stuff.
And that's really what it is. A lot of them see the United States and U.S. values as standing in the way of authoritarianism, right? And they don't call it authoritarianism. They call it like strong government, right? they see the American Constitution and American values as being things they have to overcome if they want to do what they want through just pushing whatever legislation they want at any minute. And the idea that that America represents, that people have just kind of inherent rights, that actually makes it more difficult for governments to do whatever they want.
Or just a situation where the U.S. would be more like the Latin American countries you went to, where the UN has sort of this larger power over and above the elected U.S. representatives.
And that's on the table as well. In fact, I think when we saw the WHO, World Health Organization's pandemic treaty, which just failed recently, that's kind of part of it as well. That maybe it won't be like written law, right? Maybe it's not like solid, we have to follow it, but they will have the ability to dictate. They'll have the ability to tell us what to do. And they'll say it's voluntary, but if there are politicians on board with it, then what's the difference, right?
Or well-placed lawsuits. Well, how about we transition to what Matt was kind of leading towards with the idea of yet another one of these wars. What could be that naval power? I really thought you were going to say something like Atlantis, and so that's why I was preemptively cringing. But then I realized you were making a real point.
Yeah.
So sorry for that.
Well, my point is that, you had brought up something before the show about the CCP's interest in the Korean Peninsula. And, as early as 2020, we saw our favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, say that kimchi, a traditional Korean dish, was in fact has been part of Chinese heritage since ancient times. So how many steps is it from there to taking over Korea?
So the kimchi, the great kimchi incident, that was actually part of something bigger. But I think,
No. I was joking, Josh. Are you serious?
No, I'm serious.
Okay.
Actually.
The kimchi thing was a big deal at the time.
Well, I know it was a big deal, but okay. Now go ahead, blow our minds.
Yeah. So the kimchi story, right, where the CCP claimed that kimchi was, part of China and Korea just kind of adopted kimchi, right? That was actually part of a Chinese military information warfare operation.
What? No.
I'm
Let me readjust myself. Okay,
All right, go. Yeah.
go.
I'm not even joking. It's called the Northeast Project. And so the CCP rewrote Korean history and claimed historical ownership over the entire Korean peninsula. The program they used for that, it's called the Northeast Project. And the narrative of kimchi being Chinese and not Korean was one of the many things they did where they claim historical ownership, not just of like South Korea, but of North Korea as well. They claim ownership over the entire Korean peninsula.
So what is the point of doing that? I mean, it's not just historical revisionism. They just want to make themselves feel better,
And
right?
how does Kim Jong-un feel about
Well,
this?
Well, it's the same thing they do in every other area, right? The CCP claims historical ownership over the South China Sea. They claim ownership over Taiwan. They claim historical ownership over Xinjiang and Tibet. It's the same narrative. And what they're so the Korea thing gets a bit wild. So stick with me. They also had a war on K-dramas, right?
All right,
I remember
this.
that.
Yes.
Yeah.
There was a K-drama war. And this is the story of it is, basically when the CCP first started opening up culturally, they started letting in foreign movies and foreign entertainment. A lot of American movies didn't really resonate as much, but Korean entertainment did. And the reason it did was because China has a lot of shared values with Korea because they're, Confucian-influenced countries. South Korea, maintains a lot of the Confucian values that older Chinese people probably remember. And so when they started bringing in Korean dramas and Korean entertainment, it started revitalizing a lot of the values the CCP had destroyed, right? They had the whole anti-Confucius operations in China. And so as people started getting more interested in old values and old, cultural, old portrayals of culture, the CCP actually saw it as a threat to its power, which is why I remember you covered this, Chris. The CCP made like regulations on time travel, to go after the K-dramas, because these things were making people reminiscent of the cultures the CCP destroyed. And so what the CCP is doing with Korea has been heavily like a culture war. They're trying to diminish Korean traditional culture, and they're trying to say that that is Chinese culture, and they're trying to integrate Korea into China. When I was there, actually, crazy stuff. I had no idea the CCP had as much influence in Korea as it does in South Korea. I went there because I found basically the CCP had threatened one of the Korean state-run theaters, right? It's called KBS. Kind of like we have PBS, public broadcasting. KBS is Korean public broadcasting. They have a media, and they also have one of the biggest theaters in Korea. Shenyun Performing Arts, as you know, an American, New York-based performing arts company that shows all the culture the CCP tried to destroy. They were supposed to perform at KBS. The CCP threatened KBS. And this was public. It was actually brought out in the court documents. They were threatening Korea with just massive trade sanctions, like huge trade damage, if they allowed Shenyun to perform in Korea. And so the theater actually canceled the performance by Shenyun to the point where it was literally right before the show. And so people showed up for the thing they paid to go watch, and they couldn't go to the theater because they canceled the show. So I went there to investigate, what is the CCP's influence in Korea? You actually have right now, the two political parties in Korea is this. The left wing, if you want to even call it that, in Korea, they're pro-North Korea and they're pro-CCP. They're anti-America. The left-wing politics in Korea, in South Korea, they're pro-North Korea. It's crazy as that sounds.
I know that sounds crazy, but we've had several guests on who have talked about that. So
yeah, there were even some restrictions put on media for how they could refer to Kim Jong-un. Like they couldn't use certain derogatory terms like dictator in like newspapers, regardless of who owned the newspaper.
Yeah, and so what's happening in South Korea is the CCP is heavily using culture war, business, and subversion to basically take it over. They're, in my opinion, they're on the brink of basically conquer within a generation. I think South Korea will be part of China within a generation.
Do you mean like
the rate they're
actual
going.
territory or just under their sphere of influence?
More like a puppet state, I think, because what they're using is the United Front. In Korea, the success of the United Front in South Korea is the furthest along I have ever witnessed. South Korea is further along on being subverted through the United Front than anywhere I have ever seen. And the way it works is this: in the U.S. it's not as advanced. But what they try to do is they try to capture the civil society. And so the thinking of the CCP is what constitutes power? What says, what is it that determines who rules a country? Well, you have the government, right? And then you have the civil society. And so what the United Front aims to do is change the allegiance of the civil society. And so they buy off the businesses, they buy off the entertainment, they buy off the education system. And once you control the information, once you control the news, once you control the culture, once you control the business, you control the country. And so the CCP, through the Northeast Project, again, the whole kimchi thing, through the Northeast Project, they've been doing that. And you have it so that Korean businessmen, they cannot afford to not be pro-CCP. They can't do business. If you're in entertainment, you can't afford to not be pro-CCP, or nothing you make is going to be seen, in China, which is one of the big markets they have. Their entire infrastructure is tied in with the CCP, and all the leaders, the influencers who are part of that, they're like captured by it to the point where the CCP threatens them. I mean, I'll tell you something crazy. One of the individuals I talked to, I talked to government officials, I talked to people there, they were terrified of the CCP. We had one individual who said that there was a government official in Korea, and this was off record, but I can talk about it, right? I can't name the guy. He had actually come out to support Falun Gong, right? He was sympathetic. The CCP called him to China for like a meeting. They turned off the lights in the room and they physically beat him. They beat him up.
Wow.
A South Korean government official, and they do that. They blackmail them, they bribe them, they get them involved in honey traps. And if you understand Korean culture, any kind of scandal will destroy you in that country. The people I talked to, every one of them, they were terrified, almost across the board, terrified of the CCP. And so South Korea is being subverted. And in relation to what you're talking about with Taiwan, look, the big name going around is TSMC, right? Chinese, Taiwanese semiconductors. What's the other big semiconductor manufacturer? Well, it's right, Samsung, right? And so, Korea is important in this, and the CCP is trying to get control of Korea.
Is there any attempt to push back on this? I mean, I remember the kimchi thing because people got really offended. Like Koreans got really offended about kimchi just being called like another kind of Chinese pickled vegetable, So is there like pushback, or is it pretty far gone?
So the current president in South Korea, he wants to. They don't want to say break from the CCP. They still want to work with the CCP, but he wants to form an alliance with the United States. And so that's one of his big campaign lines, is to build an alliance with the United States. Because as weird as it is, you have Australia, India, Japan, all on board with the U.S. and this kind of defensive alliance. South Korea is not part of it, right? Why is that? They're not really wanting to be part of that alliance because they're sucked into the CCP more. The current president wants to break from it, but he just lost. Not him, but the other officials. They just lost what you kind of their equivalent of the midterms, and so the more pro CCP, pro North Korea side, they just got a lot of seats, and so he's lost a lot of power. I really think that if the U.S. does not fully engage and get a lot closer to South Korea is going to get sucked in by the CCP, the way it's heading.
Well, I know there was a lot of concern about that in the Philippines. Under Duterte, there was also a similar thing where there was a big pushback against the U.S. alliance, and that did, fortunately, turn around to the point where I think the Philippines is probably one of the strongest in the region at standing up to the Chinese Communist Party. It is interesting, though. You talk about the cultural kind of takeover, because there's been this thing recently of a lot of Taiwanese celebrities having to kind of take a pro CCP stance because, again, a lot of their business depends on the China market.
It's interesting because President Lai of Taiwan had a response to this, where he came out and said something about, I don't know if this was a release or if he actually made a speech about it, but essentially saying that, like, the Taiwanese people understand what is in these people's hearts. Like that they it was kind of essentially exposing this as like a CCP pressure tactic, right? That like after his election, all these Taiwanese celebrities were forced to like go on Chinese social media and talk about like how good China is and like all this kind of stuff. And so by him coming out and saying like, we understand what's happening here, that this is like a pressure campaign. I don't know if he said it as explicitly, but like the part about, people understand what's actually going on in Taiwanese people's hearts, et cetera. It's like exposing it in a way where it's trying to like take the power away from it, because it's like just saying, we know why you're doing this. It's being coerced.
Yeah. And I think just for the audience watching, to give an idea about how much fear there is about the CCP, there was recently this convention in Australia, kind of talking about the CCP. And one of the people who was speaking he only goes by Eric. This was a Chinese spy who essentially defected to Australia. And he was talking at this event. And there was even a thing where there was going to be somebody who was going to be interpreting for him, since he speaks Chinese. And she backed out because she was terrified the CCP would do something to her. Like, this is in Australia. Like, this is the reach the Chinese Communist Party has.
Yeah, well, and they do the same thing in the U.S. We learned about the Chinese secret police stations. Chris, you're well aware they had, of course, Operation Fox Hunt. They do that stuff
Skynet.
Here. Yeah, Skynet. Yeah.
Great names.
But actually, I was actually in Taiwan also for the elections, and it was surprising actually that they're pretty divided on China as well. In my opinion, I've been saying it from the get-go that I don't think a CCP attack on Taiwan would be a full invasion. I've been saying from the get-go to probably be that they do like a castle siege type thing, surround it, cut it off. But the big thing the big weakness Taiwan has, I think that's not really being talked about as much, is actually among the population itself. Because although the DPP won, right, even though the Democratic Progressive Party won, they would not have won had it not been for some other incidents. Because remember, the KMT, the Kuomintang, and the TPP, like the new third party, they were supposed to run as a shared ticket. And that fell apart because they couldn't agree on like who should lead the new party, like the amalgamized party, right? Had they not split their vote, they would have won. And so what you have in Taiwan right now is what is actually a minority party having power. And the opposition party, between, again, the KMT and the TPP, actually having more of a voting base supporting them than them. And then also because of the way the votes sorted out, all the minority representation among the very small parties, because the way the Taiwanese election system usually works is it's set up so you have minority seats. They all lost their seats. And so you have a lot of disenfranchised voters. I think the CCP has grounds to launch a color revolution in Taiwan. That they could start up student protests, they could start up, mass movements, they could start up NGOs and different organizations to start advancing this, to hold riots even. And if they did that during a CCP action, all they need is a trigger. All they need is for the DPP to make one controversial move that will be enough for them to start protests, and the CCP will capitalize on that.
Well, there's already protests going on after the KMT legislature.
But that's a pro-DPP protest, essentially. Or, like, that's an anti-KMT TPP protest.
Yeah, but isn't it the idea that there's just some kind of distraction internally? Or does it need to be, are you saying it needs to be something kind of geared at?
Well, like a color revolution is overthrowing the government, right?
Yeah, so that remember, that's the Maoist model. Like Mao Zedong wrote the book on that, like, literally, right? How do you use minority disenfranchised, unrepresentative groups to launch a revolution? And so they have perfect ground for it because of the political divide. DPP is in power, but they actually have less public support than if the other two parties hadn't split their vote.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is I wonder if this current action by the KMT and the TPP to try to bring more power to the legislature to basically rob the executive in Taiwan of power is changing the support for
if they overplayed their
if they may have overplayed it a little bit. Because I think especially the TPP, a lot of their support was young people who kind of wanted a change. Like, they didn't like the KMT, but they didn't want, like, the DPP anymore. Because, like, essentially the DPP is, like, the establishment for young people, right? Because they've been in power now, Tsai Ing-wen, for 8 years before. So, like, it was seen as that, like, the TPP had a lot of young people support, but now if they're kind of going in with the KMT, which a lot of TPP supporters didn't like, is that going to change that dynamic? I guess we'll have to see.
There is one other thing I want to get on this podcast. You've been traveling a lot. You also pretty recently traveled to California to investigate that Chinese biolab that was there.
Yes.
So please, I'm still buckled up from the Korea bombshells.
I'm just preparing to be grossed out because it sounded like a kind of pretty dirty place.
It was, So maybe you all saw the headlines on that. Like, okay, so let's go over how the whole story went. There was a building inspector who accidentally found what looked like a Chinese biolab in California. This was like in, one of the small towns like Fresno area, right? In Kinney County, which is like, it's like farmland. It's one of the breadbaskets of America. And what it was is it was a giant windowless warehouse that was on the back of a recycling facility. The lady, I interviewed her. I did a special feature on it. The lady goes and knocks on the door. She found like a fire hose sticking out the back. She thought she was going to find a bunch of homeless people living in there. She knocks on the door, and a bunch of Chinese guys wearing like lab gear, like full lab gear, open the door. And she's like, what the heck? Like, what is this? And first she's like, okay, maybe it's some farming thing because they're farm country. And sometimes you find farmers wear stuff like that. I don't know why the heck they do it, but I guess it's not too unusual. They let her in. She starts seeing like just weird, like boxes stacked to the ceiling, like all kinds of crazy stuff. And they walk further in and just this stench hits her. And she said they had just cages and cages of like these lab rats. And she's like, well, what the heck are these? And like, oh, we do experiments on them. She's like, what do you experiment with them? They're like, oh, we don't know. Other people do the experiments on them. And she starts seeing there's like refrigerators with like vials of like liquid. She's like, what the heck did I just stumble onto? They launch an investigation. The place ends up getting raided. Long story short, there were rumors that there were like vials of Ebola. They had all these live viruses, just, live COVID. They had live COVID-19. They had HIV, like all kinds of stuff. Eventually, the whole thing kind of gets thrown out. The whole thing just disappears. One of the guys is facing charges for like just slap on the wrist type stuff, not just like misregistering stuff. It's not like he got charged with any of this. And what happened is the media came out and they said, oh, it was just a big rumor. There was no Ebola there. There was nothing really dangerous there. Forget about it. Let me tell you what I found. It turns out the FDA never even investigated. The USDA, they never investigated. They never tested the vials. They don't even know what was in there. Apparently, there are no regulations in the United States for privately run virus labs. You can buy if you create if you want to create a virus lab, you register it. You can start buying lab mice, humanized mice for like $2-3 each. You can buy lab mice. There's no regulations on testing anything with them. You can do anything you want to them. You can buy live viruses. You can inject them into the lab mice. You can do this in your garage, and there's no regulations. And what ended up happening is the whole Ebola thing. It was a refrigerator of a bunch of unlabeled vials, and they had a piece of paper that had Ebola written on it, which would have been a weapon of mass destruction, right? Defined as. They never even tested the vials. They don't even know what was in them. They destroyed them without even testing them, because the FDA, under the regulations, apparently, unless they're clearly labeled, they can't test them. And so they had handwritten labels. They had a coding system of numbers, and it was like they couldn't decode it, so they didn't know what any of the vials were. They had some that were written in Chinese. None of them were tested. To this day, they don't even know what was in that place. And basically what happened is the local county, and this is a small town in America, Kinney County, farming town. They don't have a lot of money. They had to spend taxpayer dollars to destroy the vials, to bring in a private lab company to destroy it, because they didn't want the place like becoming like a biohazard. The FDA didn't help them at all. They didn't help with any of that. And so all the evidence was destroyed. And so that's what really happened at that lab.
And is that just that there were Chinese people who worked there, or is this run by a Chinese corporation, or what?
So what happened is you had an individual who he was like a known con artist. He was on the run from the law from Canada. And basically, he was running a business where they were creating COVID test kits and pregnancy test kits and things like that. And they were mislabeling the boxes is what the crime they ended up getting charged with, right? They were buying these test kits and they were like reboxing them and saying "Made in America" when they were like from somewhere else. And it seemed like what they were trying to do was have these viruses. I guess to create COVID test kits, you have to infect mice with COVID, and then take it out of part of the mice, and then like inject the live virus onto the test kit. And there's some whole process to it that you make these test kits. They were trying to manufacture test kits, and who knows whatever the heck they were doing with all the other stuff. It was never really brought out or properly explained. But the guy, he was trying to get COVID money from the government, basically, because they have these handouts. And then the CCP apparently also has this whole system where they just fund virus labs and virus experiments and so on too. So there's a lot of money there that you have all these people trying to get in on that market to get in on, because there's money there. The individual had kind of indirect ties to the CCP. Through him, there were ties to Chinese front organizations. There were ties to the Chinese military. There were ties to the Little Red schools, which are kind of like Confucius Institute type schools, being run, I believe in Nevada, actually. So it was a lot of like indirect stuff, not on him per se, but through his network and through investors and other people who are involved with it, where you did have all these like united front ties. And when Congress, they did have a hearing on it. That was one of the big accusations. Was that there was all these united front ties to that place. But again, because there's no regulations, it's like they didn't really violate laws other than being accused of mislabeling boxes.
So what you're saying is that if we need to raise money for China Unscripted, we could get funding from China to start a biolab in like a garage or a bunker under the Empire State Building, and there's no regulation about that.
No regulation. It's big money. No regulation and big money.
There's a problem with that. You ever read Flowers to Algernon?
Flowers for Algernon?
Yeah.
Yes.
I would bond with all the humanized mice.
That's the main problem.
Yeah, we wouldn't be able to inject them with Ebola. But yeah, I imagine that would cause a very uncomfortable situation for the Biden administration that has, for the past year been so eager to restore communication, people-to-people communication with China. If suddenly it came out, there was this weird, sketchy lab that had Ebola, which is, as you mentioned, could be a weapon of mass destruction. So thank goodness those tests didn't happen.
That was one of the things that I heard people expressing, is that they felt the whole thing got swept under the rug because of the implications it would have had. But it's just people speculating, so take it for what it's worth, But the whole thing was wild. It was crazy investigating that.
Well, I cannot wait for this multipolar world order led by a China model. It sounds like it'll work out well for everyone.
Oh yeah, everyone's on the edge of their seat, right? Yeah.
Well, thank you again so much for joining us, Josh. We'll put a link to some of these documentaries you've done below. They're fantastic. But for anyone else who hasn't seen the past 3 times you're on the show, which I guess we'll also leave links below, where can people find you, follow you?
They can find my show Crossroads on Epoch TV, EPOCHTV.com. We're also on YouTube. It's called Crossroads with Joshua Philipp.
Is that how you pronounce it? Epic? EPOC? I thought it was
Epoch.
Epoch.
If you're American, it's epic. Epoch is the Queen's English. So if you want,
God, I've been speaking the Queen's English all along. I got to wash my mouth out. Well, thanks, Josh. It's been, was it fun? Horrifying? All
Why
the
not
above.
both?
Why not both?
Bit of both.
Yeah.
Yeah, always a pleasure, man. Thank you.
It's always a trip to have Josh on. I remember, like, the first time we had him on, it was like this big whole thing about, like, the history of communism. And that was kind of mind-blowing.
The second time we had him on was about what?
History of Communism Part 2,
I think it was also about the history of communism.
Yeah, it went back way further than Karl Marx.
Like, he was, like, talking about the Illuminati, like the real historical Illuminati, not the
one
conspiracy.
in the memes.
Yeah.
Oh, I just remember the part about, like, the French, and I was like, I didn't realize that was all happening.
Yeah, wild stuff.
Yeah. Well, this has also been a wild podcast.
I'm now way more terrified of the UN, which I thought of mostly as, like, an incredibly bureaucratic,
like nothing kind of thing.
Organization.
That was really interesting to me. Like, because we have that. Because the U.S. is a strong country. It's the unipolar world order. We don't have to really deal with the UN so much. COVID might have been a little...
I think there's a naming problem here, which is when you call it unipolar, right? It's automatically a criticism.
Well, hold on, to finish my point. But like that people in other countries are dealing with the UN as this actually powerful governing body. And now you can finish your... unipolar. It's something about a name.
Yeah, it's about unipolarism, which is you can call it unipolar, and it sounds like a criticism. Like we really should be multipolar, right? We should have diversity of polarity or something. But what an America-led world order is that it's led with, not perfect, but let's just say better than the great majority of countries in terms of the freedoms that people enjoy here. And it's led by values that stem from this, free market system, freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And that is the system that I do want to see. It's not about American hegemony or domination over other countries. It's about, certain values that I think most people, even if they're living in, other countries or authoritarian countries, they do want freedom of speech. They do want freedom of the press. They do want the ability to interact with a free market without being dominated by cartels.
That's why there's literally millions of people crossing the border,
right,
trying to get here.
I mean, no matter how bad, you say stuff in America is, and there are a lot of legitimate criticisms, but like, where do people from these other countries want to go? Their number one destination is America because they still see it as a land of freedom and opportunity.
Yeah, they don't seem to want a multipolar world order led by the China model.
They're not fleeing to China.
No.
Yeah. I mean, I think also it's interesting because when Josh was talking about the UN, why don't they help these countries like get the cartels under control and things like that? I feel like what the UN does essentially is it works with like NGO, like it's kind of this bureaucratic system that like what do they know how to do? They know how to provide aid. They know how to set up refugee camps. They know like they have a system to do a certain thing. So it's like they took their system and used it for this particular thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like they don't have a system for going into Ecuador and helping them
And
with
like
the
execute
cartels.
cartels.
Well, I mean, I'm glad they don't because like right now I'm like really glad that the UN,
The UN doesn't have guns, yeah.
Well, I mean, they do have a
They do have guns, but
They do
yeah.
have a peacekeeping force, but like it is not like a strong army that they can deploy to override the sovereignty of other countries.
Right.
Yet, I guess.
So
but
the UN is being like I can understand that maybe the UN in the best possible scenario they see it as the best option that they could be involved in, but they shouldn't be involved at all potentially. And there are other solutions to dealing with cartels and the cartel violence that don't involve participation of the UN, or certainly not in this way.
Yeah. But then what are they going to do with U.S. money? How are they going to get this U.S. money?
Yeah,
It's taxpayer dollars.
Right. I mean, there's the sort of the way that, as Shelley pointed out, that there's this NGO industrial complex, right, where these nonprofits perpetuate the problems they purport to solve.
yeah, I mean, I don't think that's true for all NGOs. I know that, you and I, Matt, both know people who've worked with NGOs in Africa, in Haiti, in like different parts of the
They
world.
do a tremendous amount of good.
That they do good. So
And
it's
look,
not like
Africa
an anti.
is still there.
I did meet somebody at the Oslo Freedom Forum though, who one year who was like, she worked on refugee issues, and she's like, guess how long people spend in refugee camps on average? And my guess was like 7 years. That was way under.
What?
Like,
Really?
yeah, it was. This is like she was saying, like people spend like. I don't remember if it was like 13 years or like 20 years. It was like
Wow, I don't
a
remember this.
decade plus. And it was somebody I just was talking to it like during
Okay,
one of the
maybe you did
dinners.
tell
But like, yeah, like the idea that, people get to these refugee camps and then they are stuck there, basically. So it's just like there's not always good solutions for things.
Right. I mean, sometimes a government of a country will want foreign help to get rid of a certain like cartel problem, but oftentimes they don't want the help because the government has been so infiltrated by that. And I mean, it's really sad, and I don't know what a good solution is. I do know that the United Nations coming in and providing aid to migrants is not actually helping that country in terms of governance. It's not actually helping the people who are living in that country, in this case, at least, that Josh is talking about.
Well, there's only one solution.
What's that, Chris?
It's that Nero will come back and save us.
So I guess we should just pray to the pagan gods that that's what happens.
Quick, do we have a bull we can sacrifice to Zeus?
Just the bull, I hope, and not a goat.
What?
I don't know what people sacrifice to Zeus.
A bull would be such a much more major task to deal with than a goat.
Oh, a bull. I thought you said bull.
This is why we need Nero.
Like sacrifice a
Here's
bowl?
the little bull. Thank you, Zeus. Please
Yeah.
bless me.
I heard bull and I thought BOWL. Obviously.
The ways of our ancestors have been lost.
I knew Chris was talking about a bull, so I was also really confused when he started talking about a goat, and I'm like,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah. Well, this is how we go off the rails. But this time, I'm going to take credit for it.
Yeah, I thought I was bringing Euro back. I thought that was clever. And then bowl.
I took your awesome, comeback and then just flushed
Was
it
it?
down the toilet.
Down toilet bowl. I said toilet bowl, Matt. Thank you for
Oh.
watching China Unscripted. Don't sacrifice to false gods. See you next time.